And thank you all, and thank you, Novartis, for allowing me to come out here, and to ARCS for bringing us Americans in to start off the show. So thank you very much. And kind of going through, of course, we've already disclosed that Novartis helped pay for my travel to be here and speak with you all this morning. So really to think about why I'm here, and thank you for that introduction, that I am a patient first, as many of us are. But my story goes way back to the very beginning. So I was actually diagnosed at 11 months old with a form of juvenile idiopathic arthritis. I currently have arthritis in almost every single joint of my body, and I have developed many other autoimmune conditions since. I have uveitis, I have Sjogren's syndrome, I have Raynaud's, I had a brain tumor removed 6.5 years ago. So I've lived and breathed healthcare my entire life. And originally, I actually thought that I would go on to be a physician because naturally that seemed like the right thing to do. But truthfully, in the States, I saw what the healthcare system was like from the inside as the patient. And I saw that my physicians couldn't even practice the medicine that they wanted to because of the systematic issues that certainly became barriers. So I decided maybe I would go a different route. But this is really kind of the way that I think about healthcare, is just there's so many different stakeholders that we need to understand who we're talking about at the right time. And that last presentation was great, thinking about how can we help facilitate, better systems for those that are actually practicing the medicine. And now I want us to change kind of the way that we're thinking about this and say, okay, well, how can we do this sort of innovation better to really make sure that the patients, the end users, are the ones that are getting better products and services. So why am I talking to you today? I told you I'm a patient, and that's what put me on this path. And while I didn't become a physician, I decided I wanted to become a human factors engineer and a human-centered designer, and really understand how can we actually shape the healthcare system in a way that improves the sort of processes for the patients. And I also became a patient-centered outcomes researcher at Columbia University Medical Center, where I was really focused on studying how can we improve clinical trial outcome measures? How can we improve treatment guidelines to include things that matter to patients? Because we always throw these terms at patients, oh, they're non-compliant. Yet we haven't understood all the different barriers that they're up against. And so that's where my work really began, is how can we actually look at this more holistically? Because I, as a patient, really saw this kind of firsthand. And I'm also an FDA consumer representative, so I've been able to see what sort of the regulatory process is and how we actually interact with that in the States. And I've been doing patient advocacy for the past 20 years and really ingrained in those patient communities. And so I've seen the healthcare system in all these different ways, and that's what led me to say, gosh, there just has to be a better way for us to innovate together. And it all comes down to this. We need to ask patients. They're the ones that live and breathe this every single day. They know the challenges, and it's just a unique expertise that we haven't fully valued before. And here we throw around the buzzwords of patient centricity and putting the patients at the center of care and patient engagement, but how do we actually do it? And that's really kind of what I've been seeing firsthand, is that there are people like yourselves that are attending conferences like this, but you want to do it, but you don't necessarily know what the steps are. Or you're running up against challenges, getting more buy-in from people at your companies or where you are. And so that's what I really want to talk to you about today, is how can we really understand where we're at and then have some actionable steps on how to go forward. And so when we think about this, we actually had done a white paper that we put out earlier this year that I know is on display somewhere in the booth. The ARCS booth, and I'll give you the website here at the end. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the things that we found. And this was specifically, we were talking to life science companies, pharma, and biotech, but truly it goes across the board. And at Savvy, we actually work with all types of companies, from startups in digital health to health systems to pharma. Across the board, we work with consumer products because more people want to understand how can they actually be doing more universal design for people with disabilities. And that's really where my background came from. As a human factors engineer with arthritis, people would say, hey, Jen, do you know any other arthritis patients to test out these makeup cases or these vacuums or things so that we could understand how we could make things better for all people? So I'm going to walk you through some of what we found. So when we think about patient centricity, it's obviously a loaded term, and now because everybody uses it, it kind of just makes it a little bit more null. So here's a quote from one of the people we interviewed. We don't like the word patient centricity, but if we don't say we are, then people will think we aren't. Show of hands who feels this way. Anyone else feel this way? You just feel like you have to say it? Yeah, because if not, then you just get swept under the rug. So it's just kind of become one of those things, but what does it actually even mean? Next thing we did is we actually asked patients how they felt about pharma. And 80% of the ones who had worked with pharma, like was just said, that they've started to bring patients in to either patient councils or their work, they had a positive image and the way that they thought about pharma. And that really shouldn't come to a surprise to us. And that's contrasted with the fact that less than 45% of those who had not worked with pharma had a positive image of it. And so we understand you all are people and you're working well to try to help advance the industry. And there's a lot of other things that have kind of put a sort of darker light on some of the parts of healthcare. So how can we actually make that a little bit better? What can we do? And how can we start bringing more patients into the fold so they understand who we are as people and the fact that we're all actually just trying to work towards the same thing? Another thing we asked patients was a little word association. And we said, just what words do you think of when you think about the pharmaceutical industry? Okay, everybody take a second, think about what you might be thinking. And these were the two, and I think they contrast each other nicely, or they're different, but the two that we heard the most were greedy and innovative. So I like the second one, that one's good. So how can we play off that? And again, I think we're all just human beings that are trying to work to advance healthcare, and sure, there have been things that have happened in the past that we really need to do better to improve. But we are all people, and I would reckon everybody in here does in some way consider themselves a patient. And what I found in my work is that I do tons of these conferences, and you get people up on stage and say, yeah, we're all patients, rah, rah, rah. And that's great. But here's the way I think about it. You gotta be the right patient at the right time. I don't mind when we say we're all patients. It's really galvanizing. It makes us all feel like we're in it together. But are you the right patient? And this is something we're really seeing, especially in the tech industry as they're coming into the healthcare space, is they're used to doing this sort of iterative design. They wanna go, 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 test, test, test. But they don't really necessarily know the healthcare system or the fact that patients are different than just your everyday consumer. And therefore, just asking your friends and family or just other employees doesn't actually cut it. You have to be the right patient at the right time. And that's really kind of something that I saw was when I kept being asked to sort of provide the patient perspective over and over again, I'm one patient with one sort of unique set of experiences that can't speak for everybody. So therefore, we need to make sure that we're talking to the right people that we're trying to innovate it for. And we're going to touch more on that too. So here's sort of what we consider our patient centricity checklist. And some of these are pharma specific and some of them are for everybody to consider. These are just some ideas. This is not exhaustive, just a way to kind of get your juices flowing on how you might be able to engage patients in your work. So things like new product planning. What should you actually build? Please, please, please don't build things without understanding what the needs of that patient community are. Promise me you won't do that. Co-designing clinical trial protocols. This is something that we need to make sure that these kinds of things are feasible. So how can we have patients look over them so that you don't sit around for years and say, oh my gosh, I don't understand why we're not enrolling patients or we can't keep them in these trials. Well, it's because you probably didn't understand what it took. I was on one review of a trial where they wanted the patients to come in every week and just tell them how they were feeling. Who's got the time for that? That's not gonna happen. How about a phone call? And so it's these simple, simple things, but it takes having those real world experiences to understand what that could be. It could be doing simulations, could be understanding what the strategy is around recruitment, thinking about how are you gonna be collecting real world evidence, what's important to those patients, how is it to engage with those patients, especially as we have all these additional support apps. What does that look like and what are the needs that those patients have? Usability studies. How can we bring more patients in to be testing these things earlier? Treatment decision-making. I think this is a big one when we talk about shared decision-making. If we don't back up and understand what matters to the patients early, then how are they gonna have the information that they need to make an informed decision with their healthcare provider? What's the barriers to adherence? I told you, my least favorite word is that non-compliance, right? So we need to understand what are the things within our system that make it more challenging for the patient to follow their treatment plan. It's not just because they're a bad patient. It's because there are things that are in the way. What are the marketing materials that you might be developing? In the States, we can have direct-to-consumer marketing. And there are things that I see up on my Hulu, ads that come up that are wildly offensive. How can we do better to make sure that those things aren't ending up in front of patients, or whatever that material might be to help them understand a clinical trial or things like this? And again, this obviously goes beyond just pharmaceuticals. What are patient support programs? More and more people are kind of starting to look into what this can be. What are the needs of those patient populations? Things like education programs, financial assistance, how can patients have more access, and things like patient scholarships. I'm very encouraged to hear that you have patients here at this meeting. That's fantastic, and we just need to continue to have more and more opportunities for those people to be able to attend. So what are some of the pitfalls that we see? This is something that we were, again, when we were interviewing our cohort of all the pharma and life science professionals, we were hearing from them what some of the issues were. And so I'll just kind of walk you through a few of them. First here, if it is not conducive to their schedule or not what they wanted to hear, then unfortunately, they don't always consider it valuable. And so this was from a vendor for life science companies. And I think that you guys are gonna really start to resonate with some of the things that we're about to talk about, because unfortunately, it's the truth. When we think about patient engagement, people wanna talk about it, but in practice, it's a lot more challenging to think about how we're gonna execute it properly. Just being an internal checkbox. Tokenism. We see this a lot, right? They're just saying that we talked to a patient. We did that. Yeah, we went into that community, we did one survey, and boop, we're done. They love us, or whatever it might be. We have to really think about how are we doing it more properly? How are we doing it that we're creating longer-term relationships, or how can we do it authentically, make sure we have diversity? We can't just check a box and move on, especially when we think about how long it takes to innovate something, whether it is coming out with a new digital product, or certainly the long life cycle of bringing a pharmaceutical drug to market. There's a long time that passes, and we need to make sure that we're having more and more touch points. Ignoring those who don't uphold values. This was interesting to hear internally from professionals working in the industry that they felt that there were no repercussions to their colleagues when they didn't uphold these values. There was one quote I didn't include here, but it was talking about how not everybody goes up to the company wall and reads the motto and acts on it. And I'm sure you all can think about other colleagues that you feel like, maybe they don't care as much about this and the importance of this. Or maybe it's a moment to ask yourself, where do you fall on that spectrum? And how important is this to you to actually engage with consumers and patients? But what can we do to help make sure that's really ingrained? And a lot of the time it starts with upper management. How do we get buy-in there? How are there repercussions so that if you don't uphold that, something's got to change? Ignoring unfavorable responses. I hear it, yeah. And we get companies that come to us, and we even have our contact at the company who says, gosh, my boss, they really don't want to do this because they're afraid of what they're going to learn, and we don't have time to go back and redo the trial or redo this part of the app or whatever it is. Well, I think we should all understand that is the wrong mindset. You're going to just waste all this time and money building that stuff. So although it can make you feel a little bit squirmy to feel like, oh, did we get it wrong? I hope you can understand that it's better to do that now than to wait. And so how can we make sure that there's a safe culture where it's okay if we got it wrong? Failing is fine. It's okay to get things wrong. That's how we actually then go and make something better. But if we ignore it and we just kind of sweep it under the rug, that's doing a disservice to the company because you're not going to make a successful product or service, and that's fine. But what's happening to the patients? They have to wait that much longer until then it really fails for you to start over again. And so how can we actually accelerate this process? And that's the whole point of working with patients all along the way so that we can get through that faster. Let's fail faster together. High hopes without transparency. So now that more people are working with patient groups, great, fantastic. Please keep doing that. But what are the right ways to engage and make it so that they understand that there is the possibility of failure? This might not work. This may never come to market. So we need to be able to have realistic conversations with those communities rather than just build them up, take what you need from them, and then just leave them out to dry. And I think that a lot of the time, especially in the States, what we kind of have seen, and certainly around patient data and things like this, they think that just because you're a patient, your IQ just goes down to here. You couldn't possibly understand. I get this all the time. I sit as sort of a patient rep on a lot of committees, and so the idea that I also had a PhD, it's like it doesn't work for people's brains, it malfunctions, because they just assume patients can't comprehend the data, they can't comprehend the process, and we need to re-elevate them and understand that we all just have a different level of expertise, and we can have these conversations like adults. And if we actually have that, we can engage them in a more authentic way and work together. So I really want you to just think about that as you think of how you might work with patients. So what are some of the best practices when it comes to engaging? So here's from a patient. The people who rely on your products want to work with you. We want a dialogue. We want transparency. We are the experts on living with our conditions, and we are an asset to you. So how can we actually work with patients like this who understand? Respect patients' time and expertise. There's many ways you can do that. From a time situation, understand that these things do take time. Let's be honest about what those time commitments are. I think sometimes they ask patients to come out and they don't necessarily understand what that kind of commitment is for the patient to be able to travel somewhere. I wrote a blog a couple years ago about what privilege it is to be able to attend meetings like this. There are a lot of people that are not in this room for a lot of reasons, financial reasons, physical ability reasons, other reasons like having to transport things like oxygen. They can't travel, it makes it more challenging. My business partner has cystic fibrosis. When we travel, it is not easy for him. What are the things that we're missing when we're not really kind of thinking about how can we more properly support the patient? I've been on other trips where it has been paid by pharma and they won't allow for the patients to have an extra night because it's seen as giving them like a free vacation. But yet, that patient is turning around in 24 hours and they can't handle that level of travel. So who are we leaving out if we aren't thinking about some of the accommodations that are necessary? Now I'm going to say something that may feel a little funny for people, and I know that there's been some disconnect on this, but how can we actually compensate patients? What does it look like to make sure that we are truly valuing what they are providing to us? And a lot of people have more of a fair market value, and that is exactly it. It's not like they're getting rich off of this, but I think the idea that we can't compensate patients is fraught with bias if we are only talking to people that have the time and ability and financial stability to give their time for free. And so who are we leaving out if we don't compensate them for their time? I've sat on many different committees where they say, oh, well, the doctors and the statisticians, they're not getting paid to be here at this committee meeting. Yeah, but that's built into their salaries. That's a professional expectation that they would be part of these things. And so if a patient is working a retail job and they can't go in, how can we actually make sure that their time and expertise is valued? So that's going to look differently for everybody, but don't forget that this is a level of expertise that should be compensated and thought about in a certain way. And this, of course, then leads to diversity and inclusion. And this is something that is very near and dear to my heart because I saw it firsthand. I saw that I was the person that was being asked over and over and over again to supply the arthritis patient perspective. And in the United States, there are 54 million Americans with arthritis. I cannot possibly be representative of all of them, yet they just kept coming to me. And we need to make sure that we're talking to more diverse individuals. Otherwise, you're only innovating for a certain subset of the population. Be it for a pharmaceutical or for an app or whatever it is, we need to make sure that we're talking to those populations. And I've had many companies come through Savvy, and where they start is so far from where they end because they just didn't understand the full community. They asked a couple patients that they found on Twitter or something like that that are more vocal, and that's going to be a certain sort of population that you're thinking about. So how can you do the work? How can you go to those communities? How can you start to create those relationships, and maybe non-traditional forms? It might not always, look the same between the different communities that you're going to, but we need to make sure we're more representative. Otherwise, our innovations will only serve a certain amount of people. Now, for those English majors and whatnot, you're going to yell at me for this, but I truly believe that patient engagement is a verb. It's not a noun. It's not a one-time thing. It has to be ongoing. So what does it look like for us to continually engage and work with patients? This should be something that you think about from the very beginning of a new project. What are the different touch points that you can be doing in a really authentic way? So here is what we kind of consider our equity inventory. How can we do this in a way that actually is properly done with patients? So to walk you through a few of these things. First of all, what's the issue that you're trying to understand? You have to identify that first. I hope you will identify that for any project that you're working on. And then, are you asking the people who are representative of that population? I obviously just talked about why that's so important. Are you compensating the patients fairly for their time? Are you covering costs to participate? Is there a feedback loop so patients know their impact? This is a big one that we didn't touch on yet. A lot of the time we just take. Especially when we think about clinical research or things like that, right? The patients are a subject, you take their data, and you go away and you do something else with it. And they never know how they made an impact. It doesn't really make them want to ever participate again. So if we don't give information back to them, we're losing them. So how can we actually create a better feedback loop? Because it's also really, really empowering to the patient to know that they were able to make an impact. And that's what my life has done, right? I was a patient, now I do this. Not everyone's gonna start a company and do this. But even just taking a survey and then understanding, oh, wow, because of that, you learned this and now you're creating this new support program. Or I did this interview, and because of that, it changed the direction of the new app or the new program that you're developing. That makes them feel great. And so how can we do more and more of that so they know that their expertise had an impact, especially when you think about their expertise is usually related to a really negative situation. They were diagnosed with something, they're now going through something that they never thought they were going to. To know that there's a positive spin to it is really empowering. And are you updating them on those different sort of touch points appropriately? And are you also working with other ethical companies? This is something, and I don't know if this exists over here, but in the United States we have benefit corporations, B Corps. So companies that actually have to uphold certain values and make sure that they're practicing other ethical practices. And we believe that too, that you might be able to work with patients, but then are you working with another vendor that's doing something a little bit shady? So how can you make sure that if you're gonna be patient-centered, how can you do it more holistically? So what's the ROI on patient engagement? I wish I had the perfect answer for you to all go back to your companies and tell them how to do this. It's a gray area, I'm not gonna lie, but how can we be thinking about it in a different way? So here's a quote. When you bring patient insights to your company and actually allow these insights to change the direction of the company, that's really kind of how we think about it. And so it might not be as metric-driven in the same way as we think about some other parts of our organizations, but we need to think about it differently. So if we think about what's the cost of engaging patients, what's that focus group that's gonna cost, how much do I have to pay to have the patient travel into this conference, whatever it might be, are we actually asking the right question? Or should it be, what is the cost if we don't engage patients? And I don't know who's in the audience today, so forgive me, but one of the examples that we've seen, it's a big one, was with a rollout of a new drug a few years back from Pfizer. Can I say it? Yep, go for it. Can I go for it? It's very public. Oh, I hear it in the room. It'll squirm, squirm, squirm. Don't worry, it's on our white paper, so you'll read about it. And they created a drug, Exubera. And this was an inhaled insulin product. And what happened was, they went through the clinical trials and it came to market. And what they found was that nobody was using it. And the problem Not that it's the only problem, but one of the problems was that rather than being a small little needle and give yourself insulin, it was about like this size of this container that patients had to carry around. And it turns out patients didn't want to do that. And so they pulled it from the market. Again, that's not the whole reason, but that was part of it. We couldn't get patients to want to do that. And now I don't know the whole R&D process to how they landed on that's the right size for a patient to want to carry something around. But it was a $2.8 billion loss. So how can we make sure that that doesn't happen again? That's what we need to be thinking about, is what's the cost if we don't engage patients? Because we don't want that to end up. So how do we do this? What's next? How can we actually go forward and work with patients? Well, there's a lot of different ways, and we touched on some of them. It might be, bringing them in for focus groups or things like that. It can be surveys, can be interviews, can be user testing, more virtual ways that you can have discussion boards to engage people that couldn't actually be physically present. There are lots of ways that you can engage patients. Really, sky's the limit, and I want you to think about that. How can we think outside the box? How can we be more innovative on both of our processes, but also with the ways that we're actually going to be then taking those insights and implementing them into our new product development? I want to remind you that you guys are in control here, that you're leading the charge. You're the people in this room that are thinking about how can you put the patients at the center of care. So I want you to remember that and really use that power to go back to your organizations, to talk about how you can work with patients in a way that fairly values them and drives the innovation that you guys are going forward so that you can create better products and services that are sustainable and really make a meaningful impact in patients' lives. So thank you guys for your time and attention, and I thank you for allowing me to come out and chat with you today.